Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, and back with me this week we have Spike's editor, Tom Slater.
Hello.
And back with us, it's been a while actually, is trade unionist and writer Paul Embery.
Good to see you.
Great to have you back. So coming up on today's show, we'll be talking about the Huw Edwards scandal, the emptiness of Keir Starmer, and the trans activists that wants us all to go out and punch a turf in the face. So finally, the mystery BBC presenter behind the big scandal that's been on every front page for the past week or so was revealed to be Huw Edwards. He's alleged to have exchanged money for sex pictures with a youngster who's addicted to drugs. Tom, I mean, what have you made of this scandal?
It's been a hell of a ride. I mean, you say to great surprise. It was very strange and farcical given the fact that everyone in the media, most people who went on social media had already essentially established who it was. Maybe we'll get into the fact that these ridiculous kind of privacy restrictions have where I don't see it serving anyone's privacy, certainly not the other BBC presenters who were falsely accused of being this individual. So we've kind of got out of that very kind of farcical stage now, at least. But I have to say the thing I'm most struck by now is the way in which people who are really defending Edwards to the hilt seem to me to be doing so on incredibly spurious and hypocritical grounds. Now, of course, like Huw Edwards, I don't know what went on. We haven't really heard his side of the story. He's unfortunately hospitalised at the moment with his mental health issues. The statement that his wife put out that essentially ousted him as the individual in the frame has said that he will push back in due course on these specific matters. So we wait to hear that. I don't want to see him cast out of public life on the basis of allegations from one newspaper alone. All that being said, there has been this tendency on the part of people who either have an axe to grind with the Sun and the tabloids, or who are just personally friendly with Edwards, to act like this wasn't a story to begin with.
Yeah.
To act as if revelations that a very high-paid, taxpayer-paid, incidentally, member of public life, who was engaging allegedly in this kind of activity, that wasn't something that may have been something that a newspaper might have been interested in publishing. They've fallen back on this line that because it seems like it wasn't criminal, at least according to the Mets, who have said that there's nothing from what they've seen that would suggest any crime has been committed, that therefore there's nothing there. I mean, if that's the standard going forward, that if a crime isn't committed, you don't report on misdeeds, then it's a bit of an odd standard to set, I think.
Yeah.
But also I am just struck by the fact that without wanting to engage in some sort of whataboutery or whatever, if this was someone who was a similarly prominent, say, right-wing commentator, I dare say there would have been as much condemnation from the people currently defending Huw Edwards for even much lesser alleged misdeeds, because we have seen that in the recent past. So more than anything, I am struck by the kind of the high hypocrisy at this point, which has really been pretty striking, you know, even in the midst of us not knowing much of what's going on. The responses have been very striking in that regard, I think.
Yeah, Paul, I mean, obviously, you know, we wouldn't want to see Huw Edwards crucified or anything like that. And there can be a kind of unpleasantness when, you know, certain allegations are raised about public figures. But we know it would be different if this was someone else.
Oh, it would be. I mean, it's been a sight to behold, hasn't it? Watching, you know, the liberal establishment rush to pour tributes and love and sympathy on Huw Edwards. I've absolutely no doubt that if, you know, I tweeted today, if it was a GB news presenter instead of a BBC presenter, if it was a Tory MP, their approach would have been, you know, significantly different. I'm sure of that. So it's the hypocrisy. I agree with Tom that there is an enormous amount of hypocrisy, and in many cases, don't forget, these were the same people who were pushing the Me Too campaign.
Yeah.
Which, you know, at the extreme end actually ruined careers unfairly. I mean, it was in large part, in my view, that was a campaign that was bordering on hysterical. Where, you know, even a bit of mild flirting, and, you know, no one would defend sexual harassment, of course, but even a bit of mild flirting, you know, people's careers were put into the deep freeze and stuff like that. And it just seems to me that, you know, if you're someone who politically, you know, someone within the liberal establishment doesn't like, then you're fair game. But if it's someone who's kind of on our side and working for an institution that's sort of on our side, then it's okay, we'll go a bit soft on that person. And I just think as well, I mean, these things are very painful. there are families involved. I don't think we should forget that. I remember the Matt Hancock affair a couple of years ago, and there was that terrible picture of his wife coming out of a front gate, and there were just hordes of paparazzi there. And of course, his wife and kids, who did not stand for public office, and I think didn't deserve to go through that sort of thing. And we should perhaps remember them. But I tend to agree with Tom in terms of the privacy issue. I mean, I don't think that if you are a significant, very well-paid figure within the BBC, you're a national figurehead in many respects, and you are allegedly, let's say that word allegedly, engaging in morally dubious behaviour, I don't think you can say no one is ever allowed to report on that. That doesn't mean that we all have to be interested in it. I'm not that interested in it, to be perfectly honest. What Huw Edwards' sexual proclivities are, I've got no interest in that at all. But at the same time, I don't necessarily think that we should say that the alleged behaviour of that kind, whether it's Huw Edwards or someone else, should be completely off limits.
Yeah, and there does seem to be this problem with privacy law, essentially, where that seems to explain the media's nervousness about naming him. One of the terrible things about this is that our parliament has never voted for a privacy law. There has never been an agreed definition by MPs over what should be private and what shouldn't. This law has come about essentially through, it's been judge-made. It's a product of the Human Rights Act, but it's been judges who have interpreted that act in such a way that has meant that media outlets are nervous about reporting things that they know to be true.
And in this case, I think that's been shown for everyone to see. I mean, it's so obvious that privacy is obviously very good and very important. Privacy laws, on the other hand, can create all kinds of very liberal but also farcical consequences. In this situation, you had where everyone knew, more or less, who this individual was. His name was already really being dragged through the mud, if you want to put it in those particular terms. And yet we were unable to talk about it openly. Newspapers weren't allowed to name him. As a consequence of that, amongst the pool of people who maybe weren't 100% sure, it created a lot of room for people to throw accusations at Jeremy Vine or Nicky Campbell or whoever else it might be. So it's obviously ridiculous. But as you say, the fundamental problem with it is the fact that this wasn't a law that was debated in Parliament, that was had out in public, that was something which we as a society, roughly speaking, decided was where we needed to go. This is the product of these particular rulings. And it does just make you worry about how much on these kind of human rights grounds you could have incursions, not just into what the press can talk about, but also what the public can talk about. All of those warnings that were going out on the airwaves all throughout the week of be careful what you tweet, be careful what you say, because you could also find yourselves in legal trouble for talking about this case. This has gone far beyond limiting what the Sun newspaper or anyone at News Corp is able to do. It's even about us as citizens in the social media age being able to discuss these things. So hopefully that will maybe spark some kind of awakening about what the consequences of these privacy laws are and how particularly illegitimate they are, given the fact that they weren't actually forged by our own elected representatives and properly debated and discussed in that sense.
And Paul, you said earlier, you weren't particularly interested in Huw Edwards' private life. I think a lot of people might feel the same way and think, this is obviously an important story for the newspapers to pursue, but why did it dominate the headlines for so long, for the best part of a week, and it's carrying on now? Do you think it's that maybe the media is just a bit obsessed with itself? Because we saw a similar thing with Schofield as well. Even the sort of Gary Lineker affair was the biggest story, and it has to now involve, it gets the Prime Minister involved. It gets, everyone has to have an opinion on it.
Yeah, look, I mean, the truth is we have a media and political class that are obsessed with stuff going on in their own little bubble, and really don't cover with anything like, the weight that they should do, stories that affect most people. Now, there will be, and issues that affect most people's everyday lives. There will be, and some people who will be reading the sort of Huw Edwards stuff voraciously, no doubt about it, and they'll get their pound of flesh. But I think actually you've got to get things in proportion. We're living in a cost of living crisis at the moment. You've got war going on the continent of Europe. You've got people really struggling to make ends meet. You've got public services falling apart. You've got a political class that is probably more disconnected from ordinary working people than I think at any time in my adult lifetime, to be honest. And I think this kind of stuff just shows, the kind of navel gazing that goes on within the SW1 bubble. And, as I come back to the point, it doesn't mean that people shouldn't report on it. I mean, Tom said earlier, and I think it's absolutely right, it shouldn't just be about, if something is legal, then that's fine. There's no story there, because we don't live in a moral vacuum. There are lots and lots of things. You could be a high court judge who makes a pass at every 16-year-old intern that you come across. Probably legal, I guess, but is anyone really going to say that's anyone really going to say that's his private life? Exactly. No doubt the people who are arguing that Huw Edwards, now, we should defend his privacy. If it was some sort of crusty old high court judge, people would probably be taking the opposite view. So we don't live in a moral vacuum. And my fear is there's a danger with the whole privacy thing, that it becomes a slippery slope. I think there's a contradiction here, that actually we're living in the days of social media and the internet, where we were told there'd be the free flow of exchange more than ever. Yeah. And actually privacy law, if anything, seems to be getting tighter. And the slippery slope is, you say, okay, today we're not going to report on Huw Edwards as sort of major figure within the BBC allegedly committing some sort of dubious behaviour. What does it become tomorrow? It becomes something, which is even more restrictive than that in terms of whether or not we can report. And when it becomes a slippery slope like that, I think it behoves anyone who believes in the freedom of the press to stand against it.
And that slippery slope as well, I think where that's going at the moment is towards reviving a lot of the discussions around press regulation. And we've already seen Labour, which I know we're going to get onto in a second, indicate that they're interested in kind of activating this long dormant section of the Crime and Courts Act, Section 40, that would effectively compel publishers to sign up to some form of state-backed regulator. That was essentially kind of taking the unfinished business of the Leveson inquiry and trying to put that right back at the centre. It's worth remembering that Ed Miliband, who is obviously very involved in this current iteration of the Labour Party, was very much involved in that kind of original crusade against the tabloid press. And you do feel like the combination of the Huw Edwards story, as well as just the kind of general mood music at the moment, is towards trying to go back to that particular campaign to shackle the press. All the usual suspects hacked off and so on have suddenly got their tails up again. So that does feel like where the debate is going, regrettably, in my view, for the minute.
Summer is here, and it's set to be a hot one. Now, there's really nothing worse when you're just trying to enjoy the weather than getting sweaty, down there. And that's where Performance Package 4.0 from Manscaped comes in. If you want to feel fresh and ready for anything, whether you're chilling at a barbecue or the beach, then start by going to manscaped.com and using the code SPIKED for 20% off and for free shipping. The Manscaped Performance Package 4.0 is the ultimate bundle for your summer grooming. It's got everything you need. This electric trimmer has a cutting-edge ceramic blade and uses advanced skin-safe technology. That means no more worrying about grooming accidents. The Lawnmower 4.0 has a powerful motor, a travel lock, and a super bright LED spotlight for when you need a more precise shave. Plus, it's waterproof too, so you can take it with you pretty much anywhere. And that's not all. Manscaped's Performance Package 4.0 also comes with their Crop Preserver Ball Deodorant. This soothing aloe vera formula will keep you cool from sunrise to sunset. You can't get any better for below-the-waist freshness. And as well as that, you'll also get 2 free gifts. So the Performance Package 4.0 now comes with Manscaped boxers and the Shed travel bag. They're absolutely essential for this year's summer holiday. And Manscaped has a ton of great products on offer as well as this. So if you're thinking of getting the Performance Package 4.0, then you should also take a look at the Shears 2.0. This is Manscaped's luxury nail grooming kit. It comes complete with stainless steel nail cutters, tweezers, and grooming scissors, so you can feel confident when breaking out the sandals when the weather heats up. Manscaped is sure to get you summer ready this year, so get 20% off and free shipping with the code SPIKED at manscaped.com. That's 20% off with free shipping at manscaped.com and with the code SPIKED. So this month, Labour activists, MPs and various trade unionists will be meeting for Labour's annual National Policy Forum. Keir Starmer's party is riding high in the polls, but a lot of people are asking, what policies are we going to get if a Labour government actually materialises? I mean, there's been, a lack of detail, certainly, from the leadership. There's been rows over everything from tuition fees to green policy to the economy. Rachel Reeves last week said that the next Labour government will probably stick to the Conservative spending plans. So, is this... are we unclear as to what Keir Starmer stands for, and is that a problem, Paul?
Oh, it's all so encouraging, isn't it? I mean, there's an absence of radicalism. There's an absence of ideology, not just within the Labour Party. I think across politics generally. Actually, I mean, I suspect what might happen is we might see something like what happened in the most recent Australian election, where the Labour Party won it, but not because they really inspired anyone, just because they were seen as the worst of the bad bunch, and they kind of got over the line that way. And I suspect at the next election that could be something that might happen in Britain. And talking about, the absence of ideology, I was reading only this morning, actually, an account of the 1976 sterling crisis in Britain under the Jim Callaghan government, when the Labour government went cap in hand, as the saying goes, to the IMF to get a loan. And when you read the accounts of what happened in that Labour cabinet, there were some real heavyweights in that cabinet. Yeah. The likes of Tony Benn on the left, who were arguing for a particular an alternative economic strategy. You had Healey on the right, who was arguing we've got to capitulate to the IMF and please the markets. You had people like Tony Crossland, intellectuals and whatever. He was kind of in the middle between the two. And there were regular cabinet meetings, and this is all documented, where they were really thrashing out those ideas, radical ideas in many respects, and having those big kind of set-piece contentious debates. And I honestly can't really imagine anything like that taking place in the Labour Party today. I cannot imagine people in the Labour Party, it's my party, but I can't imagine people in the front bench of the Labour Party sitting around the shadow cabinet saying, right, we've got a big cost of living crisis going on at the moment. We've got a listless economy. We've got no growth. We've got we're on the brink of a recession. We've got interest rates going up. We've got people struggling to pay their mortgages. We've got a threat of a recession and unemployment and businesses closing and repossessions and all the rest of it. How do we get out of that? What do we do as a country to grow our economy at the same time as protecting working class people? How do we make our economy more productive? How do we make it more competitive? What are the ideas? Instead of which, what they tend to do, as far as I can see, is say, well, the markets know best. Yeah. These people are the real experts. I think business are the real experts. Yeah, we can do a little bit, on welfare payments and a little bit around tax and stuff like that. But in terms of macroeconomic ideas, we've got no idea about that. Let the Bank of England decide interest rates. We're not really capable of doing that. Let's not ever challenge the financial markets in the City of London. They're too important. And the whole thing really is pretty depressing, to be honest. And there doesn't seem to me to be any particular party or any group of politicians who have got that kind of ideological heft and spark to be able to say, we need a radical change in this country. There's very, very few people in the Labour Party who I think have got that ability. Most of them would be happy just to give power to the EU, give power to the Bank of England, let them decide everything. So yeah, quite depressing.
Just to make it even more depressing, it's not only that Labour is not having these great internal debates, they're not even having a debate with the Tories about the state of the economy, about many of the sort of most important policies. Yeah. There's some disagreement over whether women can have penises, whether it's 9% that don't, or 100%, but that's about it.
That's as far as we get. No, it is striking how, on the one hand, you have if you're a Labour shadow cabinet and your response to the economic situation the country finds itself in and the economic stewardship that the Tories are offering is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And we should just shuffle some of the money around here or there. And if you want to do new spending, as Rachel Reeves has said to various colleagues, you need to find it from inside your own department. I mean, everything is so much about kind of shuffling the deck chairs on the Titanic whilst it goes down, it feels like. But I think Paul's point about the stature of politicians is so striking. It's worth saying it's not just in the Labour Party either. It's a sort of den of pygmies, Westminster, really, these days, with some noble exceptions. And you think, whilst, Starmer's cabinet, shadow cabinet, certainly is dwarfed by, if you compare them to likes of Crosland or Benn or Healey or whatever. But even the kind of Tony Blair comparisons don't really stack up. I'd loathe Tony Blair and what that government did in many respects quite passionately. But at the same time, he had a project of sorts,
Yeah.
you know, whether it was in terms of turning the Labour Party against what it was traditionally there to do. We could talk about Iraq, we could talk about all kinds of other things, but he had something about him, at least in comparison to Keir Starmer, who seems to be a sort of triangulation of a triangulator. He's several kind of iterations along of a sort of managerial politician who is surrounded by people who are equally unimpressive. And there's also the kind of discussion that happens internally within Labour about the leadership's very hard line with anyone who's kind of pushing back against their agenda, hard line with the left, kicking Jeremy Corbyn out of the Labour Party and so on, all of which I agree has been very anti-democratic. But you also think you're doing this against the left, which is similarly unimpressive and unthreatening. You know, if the Socialist Campaign Group chaired by Richard Bergen or whoever else it is at this point is the biggest thing you've got to worry about, then surely think you haven't got that much to worry about, really. So it just feels like on all sides of the Labour discussion, but also Westminster in general, really, you've just got different flavours of managerialists and a kind of few faux radicals who just make a bit of noise from time to time. The lack of substance, the lack of politics, really, to it has been really, really striking, particularly going into, as you say, the closer we get to the election, the more it feels like Labour's bluff is being called. What is it that you actually want to do?
Yeah.
And the answer being Jeremy Hunt, but with a smile. It doesn't really work, does it?
And it is striking the U-turns, just because there's been so many. Obviously, politicians make U-turns all the time, but Starmer has become an expert on it. You know, only a few weeks ago, he was trailing his plans, exciting plans for oil-free Britain. Now he's going around saying, "I hate tree huggers." It's always like night and day difference. He can't even you can't take two positions and find a middle one. Even he has to go for the complete opposite of the thing he said a few weeks ago.
I think there's a danger that if as a politician, especially in this day and age where everyone's got access to clips on social media and whatever, where you are repeatedly seen as saying one thing at one moment in time because you think it's going to get you the leadership or whatever, and then 2 years down the line, 3 years down the line, you say the complete opposite. I mean, all politicians do that to a certain degree, and you know, they get away with it to a certain degree. But if you're seen to do it on pretty much everything, then the danger is people just kind of say, well, we can't trust you really because, you know, you just lied to get the leadership, and why would you not do anything? Why would you not do the same when you actually, or if you get into number 10 Downing Street? I think Kinnock had that problem. Actually, when you think of Kinnock, he came from the left. You know, he came from the radical left within the Labour Party. You know, a boy from the South Wales valleys and was always associated with the left. And then when he became leader in the 1980s and moved to the right on many questions, nuclear weapons and so on, in the end, people felt, well, we can't really trust him, because you're just doing this because you want to gain power. And in the end, I think the public kind of like people with a bit of integrity, even if they don't necessarily agree with them. If you're somebody who goes out there and argues your case and fights your corner and takes on all comers and says, look, whatever stick I'm going to get, this is what I believe, and you might disagree with me, but I'm going to argue for it anyway, take me as I am. I think in the end, people have a bit of respect for that, and they prefer that to someone who just tries to be on message the whole time and tries to please everybody and tries to avoid saying anything controversial. But I do, go back to the discussion that we were having before. I do think we are desperate in this country for ideas, for radicalism, for the return of ideology. How do we revitalise our industry? How do we reinvigorate the real economy and move away from reliance on financial services? How do we deal with some of the big cultural issues that are facing us at the moment, where there is this massive disconnect between the political and cultural elites on some of the fundamental questions and ordinary people out there in mainstream Britain? Nobody on the left, I don't think, and as has been said across politics, mainstream politics generally, seems to have any of the answers to that stuff.
I just wanted to let you know that there are still a few signed copies left of Brendan O'Neill's new book, A Heretic's Manifesto. Now, the only way to get your hands on one of these is by donating £50 or more to Spiked. And if you do that, not only will you get a signed copy of this brilliant book, you'll also get access to Spiked Supporters, our online donor community. Spiked Supporters is packed full of exclusive perks, and membership is usually £50 for the year anyway, so all in all, it's a hell of a deal. To make your donation and to claim your signed copy of A Heretic's Manifesto and to become a Spiked supporter, just go to spiked-online.com/donate. That's spiked-online.com/donate. So at the London Trans Plus Pride Parade this weekend, a trans activist came on stage and called for women to be violently punched. Let's have a look at the clip.
I was going to come here and be really fluffy and be really nice and say, yeah, be really lovely and queer and gay. No, if you see a turf, punch him in the fucking face.
So this man, he calls himself Sarah. He's actually an ex-con. He has been in prison for 30 years for kidnapping and attempted murder. And yet there he is, calling for violence against women, essentially, for women to be punched in the face. And everyone is cheering. Paul, make it make sense for me, please.
How can you make any of this stuff make sense? Look, I mean, I would describe myself as a near absolutist on free speech. But when it comes to things like inciting violence against people of that kind, I think it's off limits. I think actually, if you get your collar felt because you've said that certain people should be physically attacked, in this case, women, then I don't think you should have any complaints if PC Pod comes along and arrests you. And it seems to me that all of this, people often say, politicians who just don't like these sorts of debates and want to try and please everybody, they say things like, we need to take the heat out of the situation. All CIS need to take the heat out of the situation, almost like a play nicely children sort of thing. And from what I can see, all of the kind of violence and unpleasantness comes from one side in the debate. I mean, I know lots of gender-critical feminists, as they're called, gender-critical. I don't know any of them who would dream of saying anything like that against any of their opponents. What they tend to do is to try to have, yes, they're passionate about their cause and they fight their corner, but they try to argue their case. They try to use the weight of argument. And it seems to me that all of the abuse and the harassment is coming from the other side. I don't see gender-critical feminists laying siege to people who are having a pro-trans meeting and trying to disrupt it and, lobbing things at them and trying to shut them down and fight them and so on. And, I think it's why so many of them get so angry at the unfairness of it. But look, this stuff is crazy. This stuff, people out there in mainstream Britain are looking at this sort of stuff and looking at the debate and looking at the position of some of our kind of political and cultural elites and listening to Keir Starmer say, for 99% of women, it's biology, 99.9% women, biology matters, but for 0.1%, almost as if you can set the rules of biology aside for 0.1% of women. Biology doesn't apply to you, where of course it does. And I do think as well, this is an example of what I would call overreach from the sort of radical trans movement, where a few years ago, I think before this debate kicked off a few years ago, I think the view of most people in this country is if someone was kind of trans and man and wanted to live their life as a woman, whatever that means, most people would probably say, okay, look, get on with it. I'm not that troubled by it. Do what you want, mate, as long as you're not kind of interfering with me. But as the demands became more and more extreme and more irrational, and it became about inserting yourself into women's sports and, women's single-sex places and, school children, their toilets and stuff like that, I think that's when most people kind of went, well, hold on a second, this wasn't the deal. We were not expecting this. This is not what we signed up for. And that kind of overreach from the trans movement in terms of those demands has backfired in a massive way. And they're not going to win this campaign. I mean, when you look at the sort of ranks of women who are absolutely passionate about defending their own sex-based rights with good reason. I know some of these women, and they will not be defeated. This debate in the end, I think this battle will only go one way, but people within the radical trans movement just don't know that yet.
Yeah. Tom, I mean, how does this sort of keep happening where there's, trans activists who are either making violent threats, or you think back to the sort of what happened to Posey Parker in New Zealand a couple of months ago, essentially attacked by trans activists. What the hell is going on?
Well, it keeps happening, as you say. So there was the Posey Parker incident, Down Under. She's also faced, and certainly her organisation and group have faced violence and threats from time to time before. I remember the first time that this issue really kind of got onto my radar in terms of how toxic it was getting was back in 2017 or 2018, I think, one of the early kind of gender critical meetings amongst the sort of the cohort that we know of now was taking place, and they already had to meet in Hyde Park to then go to a secret venue because the venue they had previously had already been shut down. And there was a 60-year-old woman called Maria McLaughlin, I think, who was punched in the face by a 26-year-old male. And you thought, what the hell is going on here? Not least because it was not really front page news. People weren't really condemning it. There was even at the trial that eventually took place, the judge chided McLaughlin for not using the gentleman's chosen pronouns when that took place. And so these things keep happening, as we're talking about, not just in relation to physical violence, but also the threats, the things that didn't happen, the kinds of horrible things that ended up with Kathleen Stock having to leave the University of Sussex. Jo Phoenix, who was an Open University academic who was supposed to speak at Essex, she was no platform. There were flyers being circulated with pictures of a handgun and "shut the fuck up turf" on it. And you think, show me one single example of Kelly J. Keane or Julie Bindle or Kathleen Stock or any of these other trans activists or even some hangers-on doing this. Show me an example of even some nutcase doing it, and then those individuals I've just mentioned failing to condemn it. It's completely in one direction. And the thing about what happened at the Trans Pride Plus parade over the weekend, what was most shocking was the reaction to it. I mean, this particular individual, you know, as you say, has been in and out of prison, seems a pretty crazed individual in many respects. But at the same time, it was the fact that as soon as he'd made his little tirade, there was applause, there was cheering. The response from Sadiq Khan, the London mayor, was to reiterate his support for the LGBT plus etc. community. And then with a bit of kind of after the fact throat clearing about not liking violence, you had Clive Lewis from the Labour Party saying, essentially, all, you know, of course, calling for violence is wrong, but we'd be lying if we were saying it was coming from one direction. And then the response from the Trans Plus Pride organisers, which was to say, of course we don't like violence, but Sarah was expressing her anger that many people feel, and they should be able to vent that. And you think, you're really morally lost if you're defending a male calling for, let's be clear about this, women to be punched in the face. That's what TERF means. It means a gender critical woman, often of a certain age. That's the kind of caricature that they have in their heads. So how that isn't something that sparks condemnation, how that's something that's kind of just brushed under the carpet as people getting a bit carried away with themselves, particularly in an age in which we're encouraged to take offence at even the mildest slights, tells you something about how morally lost that particular movement is, but also how cowardly a lot of people who should know better are in the face of it. But I agree with Paul as far as I think that is starting to change, not least because of the bravery of these campaigners and these gender critical individuals. But the fact that we ever got ourselves into this position in the first place, I think, is deeply troubling, really.
And I don't want to focus too much on this one individual, but it is interesting that their story is he says he cut his own balls off with a razor in prison, and then claims to have eaten them because he didn't want someone to sew them back on. Now, you'd think that the trans movement would want to distance itself from these kind of obviously quite not very sane individuals, but because it is so dogmatic, because it says that anyone who says they are a woman is a woman, they can't distance themselves, can they? They're kind of stuck with these people.
And it seems to me that the same people who will often say to us, whether it's on COVID or climate change or whatever, follow the science. On this issue, they seem very happy to sort of put the science aside and say, it's not really about the science, you know, it's about people's feelings. And if that person feels that way, then actually that's how the rest of society should treat them. And I just don't think you should ever, as a society, find yourself in a position where you are elevating feelings over facts. And that's what we've done on this. And in any other, with any other kind of characteristic, whether it's your race, whether it's your nationality, whether it's your age or whatever, if somebody tried to claim they were something other than what they were, if I said I was 4'2" when I'm actually 6'1", you know, if you said you were, you know, Afro-Caribbean when obviously, you know, I don't think you are, Fraser.
No.
Best not to assume these days.
Absolutely. then people would kind of look at you and say, well, hold on a second. Let's not be stupid about that. But when it comes to this, when it comes to a man saying, no, I am a woman, and you should treat me as such, some people back off and say, yeah, that's exactly how we should treat people, how we should treat these people. But eventually, if you're a woman who kind of saw the whole concepts of womanhood being appropriated like that, and we don't do it for any other characteristic, but we say that actually women are fair game. We can appropriate, your biological sex and say that it's easy enough for anybody to be. And if you have got a problem with that, you're a bigot. That seems to me to be completely mental, frankly.
And it's also just reviving the most unvarnished kind of misogyny. I mean, if we talk about all the cases that we've been talking about, whether it's Kelly J. Keane in New Zealand or whether it's the various kind of women's rights or gender critical groups who have faced the most not only violent and threatening response, but often very explicitly misogynistic kind of response, sexualized, vile insults and so on, rape threats and such like, when you've got women who are trying to just do something as simple as to organise, to gather and to speak in public to defend their rights, and their response is, fuck off, you Nazis. You can't really put this down to anything other than a kind of woke misogyny which has been rehabilitated by this particular movement. And surely this image of an individual calling for women to be punched in the face and everyone cheering, if that's not going to be the point in which we will have to kind of take a step back and realise what has happened here, I don't really know what will, to be frank.
Thank you so much for watching the Spiked podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spiked's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.